At my husband's funeral, the pastor leaned in close and whispered, "Evelyn, you need to leave now. Do it quietly, and don't look back." The scent of lilies filled my lungs, suddenly thick and suffocating, and the whole church seemed to hold its breath. What he revealed moments later proved my 55 years of marriage were a beautiful, dangerous lie. Stay with me until the end to understand why. Subscribe, leave a like, and please, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It helps to know I'm not alone in this story. My name is Evelyn Adler, and I am 78 years old. For most of my life, I was a watchmaker here in New Glarus, Wisconsin, a small town that prides itself on Swiss precision and quiet tradition. My workshop, a small sunlit room at the back of our house, was my sanctuary. I believed that everything, from the tiniest gear in a timepiece to the rhythm of a marriage, had its own logic, its own perfect order. My hands, though now spotted with age, were steady, a trait I inherited from my immigrant father. They spent 50 years mending time for others, and in my retirement, they tended to the blue hydrangeas that bordered our perfect chalet-style home. Life with my husband, Walter, was a finely calibrated instrument. He was a retired history professor, a man whose voice was as comforting as the worn leather of his armchair. For 55 years, we lived in this house, surrounded by the gentle ticking of dozens of clocks I had built or restored. Our days were marked by simple, sacred rituals: the gurgle of the coffee percolator in the morning, the sweet aroma of apple coffee cake baking in the afternoon, and the rustle of pages as Walter read history aloud to me by the firelight. We were a fixture in the community, a testament to a life lived correctly. But on that cool autumn morning, the day of his funeral, the mainspring of my world broke. The air inside the historic town church was heavy, a mixture of incense, lilies, and the collective, polite grief of our neighbors. I sat in the front pew, my black dress feeling like a costume, staring at the polished oak of the casket. There was a void inside me so vast it seemed to swallow all sound, even the organ's mournful hymn. I felt Walter's absence like a physical weight, a missing gear that had brought the entire mechanism of my existence to a screeching halt. That was when Pastor Thomas Muller approached the pulpit, a kind man who had known us our entire lives, who had baptized my godchildren and stood with me at my own parents' funerals. He finished his eulogy, his voice thick with emotion, and then he walked over to me for the final blessing. But instead of words of comfort, he leaned down, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His whisper was a blade in the silence. "Evelyn, you need to leave now. Do it quietly, and don't look back." The shock was a jolt of ice water, instantly transforming my grief into a raw, primal panic. His words didn't make sense. Leave? Now? The church was full of familiar faces, people I'd known since I was a girl. I looked past the pastor's shoulder, scanning the pews. Mrs. Schmidt from the bakery, with her perpetually flour-dusted hands clasped in prayer. Young Mr. Gable, the town librarian, looking somber. All of them watched me with expressions of pity, their heads tilted in sympathy. But now, filtered through the pastor's terrifying warning, their gentle sorrow felt like a mask. Who among them was a threat? The thought was absurd, yet it took root in my heart like a thorny weed. I felt his hand grip my shoulder, a subtle pressure urging me to stand. My body obeyed before my mind could process it. I rose on trembling legs, my gaze fixed on the stained glass window behind the altar, a depiction of a shepherd guiding his flock. It had always brought me peace. Now, it felt like a mockery. I was a lamb being led away from the fold, but I had no idea if it was toward safety or slaughter. The pastor's urgency was a silent scream in the hallowed hall, a warning that the man I had loved and buried was not just a history professor. He was something else entirely. Walking down that aisle was the longest journey of my life. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of clothing, every stifled cough seemed amplified. I could feel hundreds of eyes on my back, and I fought the overwhelming urge to turn around, to look back, as he had warned me not to. The simple act of putting one foot in front of the other required every ounce of my watchmaker's focus. I clutched my purse so tightly my knuckles turned white, the worn leather a flimsy anchor in a world that had suddenly come unmoored. Once outside, the crisp autumn air did little to clear my head. The world seemed too bright, the colors too sharp. Pastor Thomas followed me out, closing the heavy oak doors behind us, muffling the sounds of the service continuing without its chief mourner. He led me to the side of the church, near the old cemetery, where generations of New Glarus residents lay buried. His face was etched with a fear I had never seen on a man of God. He wasn't just worried, he was terrified, and his terror was contagious. I finally understood that this was not a misunderstanding. This was real. He looked around nervously, his eyes darting towards the street. "There's no time to explain everything, Evelyn," he said, his voice a strained whisper. Walter. He wasn't just studying history, he was hiding from it. The words hung in the air between us, nonsensical and horrifying. Hiding from history? Walter's life was an open book, or so I had believed. He was a man of routines, of quiet intellectual pursuits. The most dangerous thing in our house was the wobbly leg on the kitchen table. I tried to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions screaming in my mind, but my throat was tight with a cold, paralyzing dread. My entire reality was tilting on its axis, and I felt a profound sense of vertigo. He kept something for a very powerful, very patient group of people, Pastor Thomas continued, his hands shaking as he gripped my arms. They think he passed it to you. They were waiting for him to die, Evelyn. They believe you know where it is. The way he said, "it," made my blood run cold. It wasn't just an object. It was something that could get a person killed. The faces in the church flashed through my mind again, no longer neighbors, but potential predators cloaked in sympathy. The traditional post-funeral reception was supposed to be at our home. In a few hours, the very people the pastor was warning me about might be standing in my living room, sipping coffee and offering condolences while searching for what? I pictured them walking through our home, their eyes lingering on Walter's bookshelves, on the antique chests, on the very clocks I had so lovingly restored. The sanctity of my home, my life's work, felt violated by the mere thought. My sanctuary was no longer safe. The pressure to maintain appearances was suffocating. I was supposed to be the grieving widow, fragile and lost. Instead, I was a target. I had to go back to that house, welcome those people, and act as if my world hadn't just been shattered by a whispered warning next to my husband's coffin. My mind, usually so orderly and precise, was a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. I felt like one of my own watches, dropped on a stone floor, its delicate insides hopelessly broken. "What do I do?" I finally managed to choke out, the words barely audible. The question felt pathetic, a child's plea in the face of an incomprehensible monster. For decades, my life had been defined by predictability. I knew what time the sun would rise, what day the milkman would come, and how long it took to bake an apple coffee cake to perfection. Now, I didn't even know if I would be safe through the night. The future was a blank, terrifying void. Pastor Thomas pulled a small, worn key from his pocket. It wasn't a house key. It looked older, more intricate. Walter gave this to me years ago. He said if anything ever happened to him, I was to give it to you and tell you to look for the Bernese clock. He said you would know what it means. He pressed the cold metal into my palm and closed my fingers around it. The key felt impossibly heavy, a burden of a secret I never asked for. The Bernese clock. The name meant nothing and everything all at once. We had dozens of clocks. Mantle clocks, cuckoo clocks, grandfather clocks. None of them had a specific name like that. It was a riddle, a final, cryptic message from the man I thought I knew better than anyone. Walter, my gentle, predictable Walter, had left me a key to a life I never knew he had, a life of secrets and powerful enemies. He gave my shoulder a final, desperate squeeze. Go home, Evelyn. Act normal. They will be watching. I can't help you further without putting my own family in danger. Be careful who you trust. With that, he turned and walked back into the church, leaving me alone in the graveyard with a strange key in my hand and the ghost of a husband I no longer recognized. I was completely and utterly on my own. Standing there, I realized my silent struggle wasn't just with grief anymore. It was a fight for my life, and I didn't even know who the enemy was. The drive home was a blur. The familiar streets of New Glarus, with their charming Swiss-style facades and flower boxes, looked alien and menacing. Every passing car, every person on the sidewalk seemed to be watching me. Paranoia was a bitter taste in my mouth. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the sight of my own home, once a source of immense comfort, now filled me with a deep sense of dread. It wasn't a sanctuary, it was a cage, and the predators were on their way. Inside, the house was deafeningly silent, except for the chorus of ticking clocks. Each tick-tock was a countdown. To what? I didn't know. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, running my hand over Walter's books. Everything was exactly as we had left it, yet everything was different. It was all a stage, a carefully constructed set for a play in which I had been an unwitting actor. The life I had cherished was a fiction written by my husband to protect me, and now the story was over. I placed the key on the kitchen table, staring at it as if it might offer some answers. It was ornate, made of brass, with a complex bit that suggested an old and unusual lock. A Bernese clock. Walter had loved Bern, Switzerland, the city of his ancestors. We had visited once, years ago. I tried to recall every detail of that trip, searching for a clue, a memory that might unlock this terrifying puzzle. But all I could remember was the taste of chocolate and the happy look on his face. The doorbell rang, a sharp, piercing sound that made me jump. They were here, the guests, the mourners, the potential threats. I took a deep breath, schooling my features into a mask of bereaved gratitude. I was Evelyn Adler, the respected watchmaker, the grieving widow. I had to play my part perfectly. My survival depended on it. I opened the door to a flood of sympathetic faces, each one a question mark, each handshake a potential danger. My goddaughter, Sarah, bustled in, her arms full of a casserole dish. "Oh, Aunt Evelyn, you shouldn't be on your feet," she said, her voice full of genuine concern that now felt suspect. She and her brother, Mark, immediately started organizing things, directing people, pouring coffee. They were trying to be helpful, to shield me from the logistics of grief, but their presence felt intrusive. They were touching Walter's things, moving through my space, and I couldn't stop the suspicion from coiling in my gut. The afternoon passed in a haze of hushed conversations and shared memories of Walter. People told stories of his kindness, his brilliant lectures, his dry wit. Each anecdote felt like a small cut, a reminder of the man I thought he was. I smiled, I nodded, I accepted their hugs, but inside I was screaming. I was a prisoner in my own home, surrounded by people who might want me dead, forced to serve them cake and listen to them praise the man whose secrets had put my life in jeopardy. I found myself watching everyone, analyzing their expressions, their gestures, the way Mr. Henderson from the bank avoided my eyes, the oddly intense stare from a cousin of Walter's I hadn't seen in 20 years. Was I imagining things? Was the pastor's warning making me lose my mind? The line between caution and madness felt terrifyingly thin. I felt trapped, encurralado, with no clear path to safety. As the last of the guests began to leave, the sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows through the house. The clocks chimed 6, their harmonious bells sounding like a death knell. I was alone again, the scent of coffee and perfume lingering in the air. The silence that descended was heavier than before, thick with unanswered questions and unspoken threats. I stood in the center of my living room, surrounded by the ticking remnants of my life with Walter, and felt a profound, chilling isolation. My carefully ordered world was gone, replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. The phone on the wall suddenly rang, its shrill cry cutting through the silence, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, too terrified to answer it. The telephone rang. a shrill, piercing cry that sliced through the heavy silence of the house, kept ringing, insistent and demanding, each pulse a jolt to my already frayed nerves. I stood frozen in the living room, my hand clutching the back of a velvet armchair, simply staring at the old rotary phone on the wall. Answering it felt like opening a door to a predator I couldn't see. My mind screamed at me to pick it up, to demand answers, but my body was paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like being encased in ice. The sound was a violation, an intrusion into the fragile, terrifying bubble my home had become. Finally, the ringing stopped. The silence that rushed back in was somehow worse, heavier, and more menacing than before. Now, the only sound was the chorus of ticking clocks, dozens of them, each marking a second of my life that was now fraught with unknown danger. They were no longer the comforting heartbeat of my home. They were a countdown. The slow, deliberate tick of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a judge's gavel, marking time until a sentence was carried out. I felt like a specimen under glass, watched and waited for by unseen forces. I walked back to the kitchen and stared at the ornate brass key Pastor Thomas had given me. It lay on the worn oak table, a small object carrying an impossibly large weight. His words echoed in my head, a terrifying loop. Walter. He wasn't just studying history, he was hiding from it. What could a quiet, gentle man like my Walter have done to warrant such a fate? He was a man of books and quiet. Contemplation, not of secrets that could get his wife killed. The 55 years of our life together felt like a fragile porcelain doll, now shattered on the floor, revealing a hollow, dark interior I never knew existed. My mind replayed the faces from the funeral reception. Mr. Henderson, the bank manager, with his too quick smile and averted eyes. Walter's distant cousin, Arthur, who had stared at me with an intensity that went far beyond simple grief. Were they part of it? Or was I? Descending into a paranoid madness, seeing threats in the familiar faces of my neighbors? The line between caution and insanity was blurring, and I was walking it alone, with only a cryptic warning and a mysterious key as my guides. The scent of leftover coffee cake still hung in the air, a ghost of the normalcy that had been stolen from me. A sudden, hot wave of anger washed over me, eclipsing the fear for a moment. Anger at Walter. How could he do this? How could he build a life with me on a foundation of such a dangerous lie, and then leave me to face the consequences alone? This secret wasn't just a part of his past. It was now my present, a venomous inheritance. This anger was a new, sharper kind of grief, a mourning not for the man I had lost, but for the man I had never truly known. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than his death, but the anger was a fire, and it burned away the frost of my paralysis. I am Evelyn Adler. I spent 50 years of my life making sense of chaos, finding order in a jumble of springs and gears. I would not simply sit here and wait for the unknown to consume me. I had a puzzle to solve, and the only clue I had was the name, the Bernese clock. I picked up the key, its cold weight a firm reality in my trembling hand. My fear was still there, but now it had a direction. It had a purpose. I retreated to my workshop, my one true sanctuary. The familiar scent of lubricating oil, aging wood, and polished brass filled my lungs, calming the frantic rhythm of my heart. Here, surrounded by the tools of my trade, the loops, the tweezers, the tiny screwdrivers, I felt more like myself. This was a place of logic and precision, where every problem had a solution if you looked closely enough. I would approach this not as a terrified widow, but as a watchmaker. I would dismantle the problem, piece by piece, until I understood its mechanism. I started with the most logical step, a mental inventory of every clock in our house. The stately grandfather clock in the foyer was a Black Forest original, a gift from my parents. The mantel clocks were mostly American and English antiques. None of them had any connection to Bern, the Swiss city Walter's ancestors were from. We had visited once, a lifetime ago. The memory was hazy, filled with the taste of rich chocolate and the sound of the Zeitglocke, the city's famous astronomical clock tower. Was there a clue in that trip? The riddle gnawed at me. The Bernese clock. It didn't sound like a formal name or a brand. It sounded personal, a nickname. Walter had a habit of giving things his own names. He called our temperamental old car the Baron, and his favorite reading chair the Judge. What clock had he singled out? What made one of them uniquely Bernese to him? I realized I was looking for a label when I should have been looking for a memory, a personal connection. My search began in earnest. I moved through the house with a new, methodical energy, my fingers tracing the polished wood of each timepiece. I tapped on casings, listening for hollow sounds, my watchmaker's touch searching for hidden panels or false bottoms. The clocks ticked on, indifferent to my frantic quest, their familiar faces now seeming like masks hiding secrets. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the rooms, turning familiar shapes into lurking monsters. Doubt began to creep back in. I ended up in Walter's study, the heart of his world. The Saia room was saturated with his presence, the faint, sweet aroma of his pipe tobacco clinging to the heavy drapes, the stacks of books on European history, the worn leather of his armchair. I ran my hands over the spines of his books, half expecting to find a hidden switch or a hollowed-out volume. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, scholarly life of the man I thought I knew. The weight of my failure pressed down on me, and I sank into his chair, utterly defeated. Perhaps Pastor Thomas had been mistaken. Perhaps Walter's words were the ramblings of a dying man, a final, confused memory that meant nothing. My anger had cooled into a familiar, aching grief. I was just a lonely old woman, chasing shadows in a silent house. I was about to give up, to surrender to the fear and the unknown, when my eyes landed on a framed photograph on his desk. It was from our trip to Bern. We were standing in front of the cathedral, young and smiling, Walter's arm wrapped protectively around me. And then, it hit me. A memory sharp and clear as the crystal on a watch face. On that same trip, Walter had insisted on buying a cuckoo clock from a tourist shop. I had protested. It was garishly carved, a cliché. But he had been charmed by it, by the little wooden bird that popped out to sing its cheerful, simple song. He had hung it in the upstairs hallway, a place I rarely lingered, and I remembered what he said as he hung it, his eyes twinkling. Now we'll always have a little piece of Bern with us. My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't a priceless antique or a masterpiece of horology. It was the touristy, sentimental clock I had always overlooked. I flew out of the study and up the stairs, my old knees protesting. The hallway was dim, and the clock hung on the wall, silent and unassuming. It was just as I remembered, dark wood carved with an overabundance of leaves and a small, cheerful-looking bird perched above the clock face. It was the last place I would have ever thought to look. With trembling hands, I lifted the clock off its hook. It was heavier than it should have been, a solid, dense weight that felt wrong. I carried it to the bedroom and laid it carefully on the quilt. My watchmaker's eyes scanned every inch of its surface, searching for the telltale sign of a hidden compartment, an unnatural seam, a screw that served no mechanical purpose. My fingers, trained by decades of delicate work, explored the intricate carvings on the back, and there it was, tucked. Away within the swirling design of a carved ivy leaf was a tiny, dark hole. It wasn't part of the design. It was a keyhole, so cleverly hidden that you would never find it unless you knew exactly where to look. It was old and made of dark brass, a perfect match for the key I held in my hand. My breath hitched in my throat. This was it, the point of no return. I retrieved the key from my pocket. My hand shook so badly it took me 3 tries to insert it into the lock. When I finally did, it slid in with a smooth, satisfying precision. I turned it. The click of the tumblers falling into place echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. A small, almost invisible section of the back panel, no larger than a deck of cards, popped open by a fraction of an inch. It wasn't a door. It was a hidden drawer. I pried it open with my fingernail. The space inside was lined with dark velvet. It didn't contain jewels or stacks of money. Instead, nestled in the center, was a small package, wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. It was cool to the touch. I carefully lifted it out. It was light, but it felt like the heaviest thing I had ever held in my life. This was the secret, the reason for the pastor's warning, the thing that powerful people were willing to wait 55 years for. My fingers fumbled with the knot. Inside the oilskin was a thin, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with Walter's neat, meticulous script. I opened it, and my blood ran cold. The writing wasn't in English. It was German, a language I only understood in fragments, but I recognized enough to know what I was looking at. It was a ledger, columns of dates from the 1940s, followed by unfamiliar names and long strings of numbers that could only be Swiss bank accounts. This was what Walter was hiding from. Not history from a book, but a piece of it he had carried with him his entire life. A record of something dark, something from the war. The gentle professor, my quiet husband, had been a guardian of a secret so profound it had shaped our entire existence without my knowledge. The quiet life in New Glarus, the academic career, our peaceful home, it was all a facade, a fortress he had built to protect this single small book. Holding the ledger, I understood. The game had changed. I was no longer just the grieving widow being hunted. I was now the custodian of the very thing the hunters wanted. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now mixed with a steely resolve. I could not run. I could not hide. To survive, I had to understand what was written on these pages. My quiet, orderly life was over. A new, dangerous one had just begun. I carefully rewrapped the book, my mind racing. The clocks downstairs chimed 7, their melody no longer a threat, but a call to action. I slid the secret drawer shut and hung the cuckoo clock back on the wall, its cheerful facade now a grim irony. I walked over to the window and looked out at the quiet, peaceful streets of my town, now aware of the sharks that swam beneath the calm surface. They thought I was a fragile old woman, lost in her grief. They were wrong. I was a watchmaker, and my husband had left me one final, complex mechanism to repair. My life depended on it. I walked back to the phone, my steps firm and steady. This time, if it rang, I would answer it. The turning point had passed. My silent struggle was over, and a new, louder fight was about to begin. My first move was a fool's errand, born of desperation and the naive belief that a simple tool could solve a complex problem. I retrieved my old German-English dictionary from the bookshelf, its spine cracked and its pages yellowed with age. Sitting at the kitchen table under the harsh glare of the overhead light, I opened the ledger. The ink was a faded brown, Walter's handwriting a series of elegant, tight loops, but the words were a fortress. I spent hours cross-referencing single terms, trying to build sentences that crumbled into nonsense. The dictionary was for tourists asking for directions, not for deciphering a 55-year-old conspiracy. The sheer scale of my ignorance was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. Frustration was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I nearly threw the ledger across the room, nearly screamed into the oppressive silence of the house. This was Walter's world, a world of academic rigor and linguistic nuance, and I was an intruder with a child's vocabulary. The fear I had managed to suppress came roaring back, whispering that I was in over my head, that I was just a watchmaker, an old woman who should be tending her garden, not meddling in the dark secrets of the past. The ticking of the clock seemed to mock my slow, useless progress, each tick a reminder of time I didn't have. But the next morning, something shifted. As I watched the sun rise, casting a soft pink glow over my hydrangeas, the watchmaker in me took over. The problem wasn't the mechanism, it was my approach. I had been trying to force the gears. I needed patience, precision, and the right tools. I put away the useless dictionary. My new plan was risky, exposing me to the outside world, but it was necessary. I would have to go to the public library in Monroe, the next town over. Using the library here in New Glarus, where everyone knew me, was an unthinkable risk. That first drive to Monroe was terrifying. I felt like a spy in a cheap novel, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, convinced every car was following me. The 20-mile journey felt like crossing a continent. In the library, the fluorescent lights hummed, and the air smelled of disinfectant and old paper. I found a computer in a secluded corner, my back to the wall. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I typed "online German translators" into the search bar. I felt a profound sense of shame, as if I were cheating on a test, but survival had erased any room for pride. I developed a new clandestine routine. 3 times a week, I would drive to Monroe, armed with a small notebook where I had meticulously copied sections of the ledger. I would sit for hours, translating names, dates, and cryptic notes, my body coiled with tension. I learned that many of the entries were followed by the name of a Swiss bank and what looked like a description of an item: a painting, Monet, a violin, Stradivarius, a collection of porcelain figurines. It wasn't just money. It was a catalog of stolen treasures, a silent testament to lives that had been plundered and destroyed. The work was grueling and emotionally draining. Each translated entry was a ghost story. I began to see the names not as ink on a page, but as people whose entire worlds had been stolen and funneled into the cold, secret vaults of Switzerland. My anger at Walter was slowly, painfully, transforming into a deep, aching sorrow for him. He hadn't been a conspirator. He had been a witness, a record keeper. He had carried this graveyard of memories with him for his entire adult life, protecting it, and by extension, protecting me from it. Our peaceful life was the wall he had built around this horror. My new life was one of stark contrasts. By day, I was Evelyn Adler, the quiet widow of New Glarus. I accepted casseroles from neighbors, made small talk at the grocery store, and tended my garden, my hands in the cool, familiar earth. But by night, I descended into the shadows of the 1940s, surrounded by the ghosts of the Holocaust. I slept in short, fitful bursts, my dreams filled with unfamiliar faces and the cold, metallic click of a vault door swinging shut. The strain began to show. I lost weight, and dark circles formed under my eyes. The first real external threat came not from a shadowy figure, but from the well-meaning concern of my goddaughter Sarah. She stopped by one afternoon, unannounced, using the spare key we'd given her years ago. I was at the kitchen table, the ledger open. My translation notes spread all around me. The sound of the door opening sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me. I swept everything into a grocery bag and shoved it under the table just as she walked into the room, her face a mixture of love and worry. The close call left me shaking for an hour. "Aunt Evelyn, you look exhausted," she said, her voice laced with a gentle accusation. "You're not eating. You're isolating yourself. People are worried." Her words were meant to be kind, but they felt like an interrogation. Each question a probe searching for the truth I couldn't tell her. I had to lie, to invent stories about sleepless nights and a lack of appetite due to grief. Lying to Sarah, a girl I had loved like my own daughter, felt like a small, sharp betrayal, another piece of my old self I had to sacrifice to survive. The internal conflicts were just as relentless. There were moments of crushing doubt when the old Evelyn would scream at me to stop. "Burn the book," a voice in my head would whisper. "Walk away. Forget you ever saw it. You've earned your peace." The temptation was immense. I could end it all, go back to the simple, quiet life of a grieving widow. But then I would look at the names, at the list of stolen lives, and I knew I couldn't. Walter had passed this burden to me, and to abandon it would be to betray not only his memory, but the memory of every soul listed in that ledger. My discipline hardened. I became more careful, more methodical. I bought a small safe and bolted it to the floor in the back of my workshop closet. The ledger and my notes went in there every night. I varied my trips to the library, sometimes going to Madison instead of Monroe. I started to feel less like a terrified victim and more like a reluctant soldier. I was learning the rules of this new secret war. The precision and patience that had defined my life as a watchmaker were now the very tools I was using to stay alive. The breakthrough came on a cold, rainy Tuesday at the University of Wisconsin's library in Madison. I had started cross-referencing the names from the ledger with online historical archives. Most yielded nothing, but one name, Jakob Rosenthal, linked to a faded, digitized newspaper article from 1948. It was a brief story about a German Jewish art dealer who had disappeared in 1943, along with his entire priceless collection of Impressionist paintings. The article mentioned that his family had been trying for years to locate the missing art, with no success. My breath caught in my throat. I checked the ledger. Next to Jakob Rosenthal's name was a list of 6 paintings, including a Monet and a Renoir, followed by the name of a bank in Zurich. It was all there. This wasn't just a list, it was a key. It was the proof the Rosenthal family had been searching for. For the first time, this abstract horror had a concrete story. A family I could almost picture. A loss I could almost touch. The ledger wasn't just a burden anymore. It was a weapon for justice. That discovery changed everything. My fear, which had been a constant cold companion, was replaced by a hot, focused sense of purpose. I wasn't just protecting myself now. I was the custodian of a truth that had been buried for nearly 80 years. Walter hadn't just left me a secret. He had left me a mission. The weight on my shoulders was still immense, but it was no longer the dead weight of a secret. It was the living weight of a responsibility. I finally understood the man he had been forced to become. My research intensified. I was no longer just translating. I was investigating. I spent days learning about Nazi-looted art, dormant bank accounts, and the complex, often frustrating process of restitution. I felt more alive, more engaged with the world than I had in years. The quiet, predictable rhythms of my old life seemed to belong to another woman, someone I barely recognized. The grief for Walter was still there, a constant ache in my heart, but it was now woven together with a profound respect for the silent battle he had fought his entire life. I started to think beyond just understanding the ledger. What was the endgame? I couldn't keep this information to myself. Hiding it would be a victory for the very people who had stolen these lives and treasures. These powerful, patient people Pastor Thomas had warned me about were not just after a book. They were after the silence it could buy them. They were the descendants, the institutions that had profited from this theft and were still profiting. They were waiting for the last witness to die, so the secrets could die forever. One evening, I found myself staring at my reflection in the dark glass of my workshop window. The woman looking back at me was not the same one who had sat, shattered, in that church pew. Her eyes were tired, yes, but they were not defeated. They were sharp, focused, the eyes of a watchmaker who has found the broken gear and knows exactly what needs to be done to fix it. The fragility was gone, replaced by a quiet, unyielding strength I never knew I possessed. I realized I couldn't do this alone. I was an old woman with a secret book. To fight this battle, I needed allies, people with the power and resources to bring this truth to light. It was a terrifying thought, inviting more people into this circle of danger. But the alternative, letting the secrets in the ledger die with me, was no longer an option. It would be the ultimate betrayal of Walter, of Jakob Rosenthal, and of all the other ghosts whose stories were written in my husband's elegant hand. My hands, which had trembled with fear for weeks, were now perfectly steady. I went to the phone, the same phone that had once paralyzed me with its ringing. I picked up the receiver, the cool, heavy plastic a comfort in my palm. I knew who I had to call. There was a journalist, a man I had read about who specialized in investigating cold cases from the war. His office was in Chicago. It was a long shot, a leap of faith into an even more dangerous world. I dialed the number, my heart pounding not with fear, but with a powerful, clarifying resolve. As the phone began to ring on the other end, I looked around my quiet home, at the dozens of clocks ticking in perfect unison. They no longer sounded like a countdown to my end. They sounded like a symphony of purpose, the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a mission that was just beginning. I was no longer just Evelyn Adler, the widow. I was the keeper of Walter's final, most important clock, and it was time to make it chime. Act 4. The Conquest and the Message. The journalist's name was David Chen. His voice on the other end of the line was exactly what I didn't expect. Young, calm, and deeply skeptical. I explained my situation in the most level tone I could muster, a watchmaker laying out the specifications of a broken timepiece. I didn't speak of my fear, only of the facts, the funeral, the pastor's warning, the clock, the ledger. There was a long pause on the line, a silence so heavy I could hear the faint hum of his office in Chicago. I expected him to dismiss me as a grieving, confused old woman, but then he asked one question that changed everything. "Mrs. Adler, can you read me one of the names and the bank next to it?" I did, and the silence that followed was different. It was the sound of a hunter catching a scent. Our first meeting was a week later, at a sterile, anonymous diner off the interstate, halfway between my world and his. I sat in a red vinyl booth, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of me, the scent of frying bacon heavy in the air. I had spent the previous days like a seasoned spy, driving to Madison to make 3 separate sets of photocopies of the ledger, hiding each in a different location in my house. The original was locked back in the safe. When David Chen walked in, he was just a young man in a rumpled coat, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He sat down and simply said, "Let me see it." As I slid the thick envelope of copies across the table, I felt a transfer of power, a burden being shared for the first time. He spent nearly an hour poring over the pages, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to stunned disbelief. He didn't need a dictionary. He was fluent in German. He would occasionally look up at me as if seeing me for the first time, this quiet woman in a simple wool coat who had been sitting on a historical bombshell for weeks. This is a map," he whispered, his voice full of a reverence that sent a shiver down my spine. "It's a map to a graveyard of stolen history." In that moment, I was no longer just a frightened widow. I was the keeper of the map, and I had finally found a navigator. My intangible victory was the simple, profound relief of not being alone anymore. The weeks that followed were a blur of clandestine phone calls and encrypted emails. David assembled a small, trusted team, a historian specializing in Nazi-looted art and a forensic accountant. They worked from the copies, their expertise slowly unlocking the secrets Walter had so carefully guarded. Back in New Glarus, I lived a double life with excruciating precision. I attended my church group, I discussed the weather with my neighbors over the garden fence, and I baked my apple coffee cake, the familiar aroma a comforting lie in a house that had become the headquarters of a secret investigation. Traditio. Contrast between the woman I was and the woman I had to pretend to be was a chasm I crossed every single day. The first tangible proof came in a hushed phone call from David. The historian had authenticated one of the ledger's entries, connecting the name of a Dutch Jewish family to a specific set of 17th-century porcelain figurines that had vanished from Amsterdam in 1942. The forensic accountant, through a series of discreet inquiries, found a corresponding dormant trust at a Geneva bank, established in 1946 and untouched for over 70 years. It was real. Every name, every number, every stolen memory was real. The news didn't bring me joy, only a cold, grim sense of validation. The ghosts in Walter's book were starting to speak, and I was their unwilling medium. My transformation was not a sudden revelation, but a slow, gradual tempering, like steel in a fire. I remembered the woman I was at Walter's funeral, a fragile creature shattered by grief and a whispered warning, a woman who was terrified to answer her own phone. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who could now discuss forged provenance documents and Swiss banking laws without flinching. I had learned a new language, not of German, but of secrets and lies. My hands, once dedicated to the delicate balance of gears and springs, were now helping to rebalance the scales of history. The outside world began to react before I was ready. David's first article was published in a major international newspaper. It was carefully worded, referring to a recently discovered wartime ledger and a source in the American Midwest. But the details it contained were explosive, naming the Swiss bank and describing the stolen porcelain. The story sent shockwaves through the art world and the discreet circles of international finance. The bank issued a terse denial, but the seed of truth had been planted, and it was beginning to sprout. I felt a new kind of fear, the fear of success, of the attention it would inevitably bring. In New Glarus, the reaction was more subtle, a ripple of unease. Mr. Henderson at the bank started avoiding me, his usual friendly greeting replaced by a curt nod if he saw me on the street. People would stop and stare at my house for a moment too long. The town's quiet harmony had been disturbed. My goddaughter Sarah finally confronted me, her face pale with worry as she held up a copy of David's article. "Aunt Evelyn," she said, her voice trembling, "this is about Grandpa Walter, isn't it?" The question hung in the air of my kitchen, a moment of reckoning I could no longer postpone. Looking into her frightened, loving eyes, I made a decision. I couldn't tell her everything. It was too dangerous. But I could no longer bear the weight of lying to her. I told her that Walter had been the keeper of a terrible secret from the war, a record of injustices, and that I was now trying to make things right. I watched as her fear slowly morphed into a fierce, protective resolve. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice firm. "I'll help you." Her trust, her unwavering loyalty, was an unexpected gift, a reinforcement I didn't know how much I needed. My world of secrets now had one more trusted soul in it. The pressure mounted. The bank, cornered by the mounting evidence David's team was leaking, finally launched an internal investigation. It was a public relations move, but it was a crack in the dam. Governments and restitution organizations got involved. The small secret war I had been fighting from my kitchen table had erupted onto the world stage. I was no longer just a source. I was a catalyst. The name Evelyn Adler was still unknown to the public, but my actions were moving mountains, forcing a reckoning that had been delayed for 80 years. Then came the greatest conquest of all. The Rosenthal family, descendants of the art dealer from the ledger, were found. David arranged a video call. I sat in Walter's study, staring at the computer screen, my heart pounding. A man and a woman, both in their late 60s, appeared. They were Jakob Rosenthal's grandchildren. With David translating, I told them what I knew, what their grandfather had lost. When I described the Monet, a painting of water lilies their grandmother had loved, the woman on the screen began to weep silently. They weren't tears of sadness, but of release. "We knew," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our family has told this story for generations. But we never had proof. We were just the children of ghosts." In that moment, I understood the true weight of Walter's burden and the profound meaning of my mission. I was giving these ghosts their voices back. I had helped restore not just a painting, but a family's history, their truth. It was a victory so profound, so deeply human, that it dwarfed every fear I had ever felt. This was why Walter had protected the ledger. This was the justice he had silently hoped for. The fallout for the perpetrators was swift and devastating. The powerful, patient people were not a shadowy cabal, but the board of a prestigious foundation, run by the descendants of the very bankers who had collaborated in the theft. Their modern empire was built on a foundation of stolen lives. David's reporting exposed them relentlessly. They were undone, not by violence, but by the meticulous, undeniable truth contained in Walter's ledger. Their names were ruined, their foundation dismantled, and they were buried in lawsuits that would last for decades. They had waited for me to die, but they had underestimated the watchmaker. My life now is nothing like I ever imagined. The after is a strange and vibrant landscape. I am no longer anonymous. When the full story came out with my consent, the world learned about the widow from Wisconsin. Reporters camped on my lawn for a week. The initial shock in New Glarus, the whispers and the stares, eventually settled into a quiet, profound respect. Mrs. Schmidt from the bakery now gives me an extra pastry with a knowing look in her eye. I have become an unlikely symbol of quiet strength, a testament to the fact that courage has no age limit. I spend my days now working with David and several restitution organizations, helping other families find their own stolen histories within the pages of Walter's ledger. My workshop is no longer just for clocks. It's a command center. The precise, methodical skills I once used to mend timepieces are now used to mend families, to piece together shattered pasts. I have found a purpose that extends far beyond the borders of my small town and my quiet garden. I am busier and more alive at 78 than I was at 58. I often think of Walter. The anger I once felt has long since dissolved, replaced by a deep, compassionate understanding. I see his 55 years of silence not as a betrayal, but as an act of profound love, a shield he held up to protect me from the horror he carried. He lived a quiet life so that I could have a peaceful one. By finishing his work, by bringing the truth to light, I have finally, truly honored his memory and the silent, heavy burden he bore for so long. My grief is no longer an empty void. It is a monument to his hidden courage. The contrast between the woman I was and the woman I am is stark. The old Evelyn's world was circumscribed by her home, her garden, her town. It was a world of predictable rhythms and quiet contentment. The new, Evelyn's world is vast and complex, filled with international calls, historical documents, and the faces of strangers who thank me with tears in their eyes. I lost the simple peace of my old life, but I gained a powerful, resonant purpose that makes every tick of the clock meaningful. External reactions have been a strange mix of awe and disbelief. Some people in town still can't reconcile the quiet Mrs. Adler they knew with the woman who took on a Swiss banking dynasty. My goddaughter Sarah has become my fierce protector, managing my schedule and shielding me from unwanted attention. She looks at me with an admiration that both warms my heart and makes me feel like an imposter. I am still just Evelyn, the watchmaker, who simply did what had to be done. My personal reflection on this journey is simple. I was terrified every single step of the way. Courage, I've learned, is not the absence of fear. It is the meticulous, deliberate act of taking the next logical step, and then the next, even when your hands are shaking. It's about focusing on the single broken gear in front of you, not the overwhelming chaos of the entire shattered machine. My whole life had been a training for this one impossible task. I've come to see that life itself is like one of my old clocks. It can be wound too tight with secrets. Its hands can be frozen by grief, and its delicate mechanism can be shattered by an unexpected blow. We can be broken by loss, by betrayal, by the weight of a past we never chose. But the tools for repair are often already in our hands, forged by the very life we have lived. Patience, precision, a steady hand, and the courage to look closely at the broken parts. These are the things that can set time in motion again. The people who tried to silence Walter's story believed that a quiet, ordinary life was a weak one. They were wrong. A life of discipline, of quiet observation, of methodical work, builds a strength that flashy power can never comprehend. They thought I was a fragile relic from another time. They didn't realize I was a master of mechanics. I understood that even the most complex and intimidating machine is just a collection of small, interconnected parts, and any machine can be dismantled if you find the right key. I now live with the ghosts from Walter's ledger. They are no longer a source of fear. They are my companions. Their stories are a constant reminder that the past is never truly past, and that the fight for justice has no statute of limitations. My quiet home, once a symbol of a beautiful lie, is now a testament to a difficult truth, a place where history was finally heard. The ticking of the clocks is no longer a countdown to an ending, but the steady, enduring rhythm of memory itself. I still tend to my blue hydrangeas. I still bake my apple coffee cake. Some parts of the old Evelyn remain, anchors in this new, turbulent life. But when I look at my hands, I no longer see just the hands of a watchmaker or a gardener. I see the hands that held a secret, that turned a key, that dialed a number, and that helped, in some small way, to wind the clock of justice forward again. My journey began in the darkest moment of grief, with a terrifying whisper in a silent church. It has led me here, to a place of purpose I never could have imagined. I learned that the most profound transformations are born not from grand gestures, but from a series of small, courageous decisions made in the quiet moments when no one else is watching. The world may break you, but it cannot stop you from picking up your tools and beginning the slow, patient work of repair. And so, my message to you is this: look at your own hands. Think of the skills you have honed over a lifetime of quiet, ordinary work. Your patience, your precision, your unique understanding of the world. Those are not small things. They are your tools, and you never know when you might be called upon to use them to repair something far bigger than you could ever imagine. Do not underestimate the power you hold in a quiet life. It is the steady hand that can, in the end, change the world.